Biden administration and Congress, or at least some in Congress, are trying to send additional military resources to Ukraine to assist in its defensive war with Russia. But the funding is being held up as Congress sorts out its overall funding of the U.S. government. Now, the source of the holdup is as I said, a subset of Republican members of the House. The last time there was funding before Congress for Ukraine, 71 Republican House members voted against it. Let's assume that's the floor, and the number's only going to go up from there. That is actually what Speaker McCarthy is trying to contend with as he cobbles together the votes for Ukraine military funding. It will get taken care of in the Senate and then come back to the House, but no matter how it gets sliced and diced, there is this growing resistance to support for Ukraine from Republican elected officials. Why? What's going on here? Well, one piece that I was particularly interested in, recently published by Fox News, attempted to speak directly to Republican members of Congress on this issue. It was co-authored by Mike Pompeo, former Secretary of State and director of the CIA in the Trump administration, and a member of Congress who was a real leader on national security issues from the state of Kansas, and Aaron MacLean. Aaron is our guest today. I wanted to check in with Aaron because not only has he been on the front lines of policymaking in Washington, he's been on the front lines of military action. We'll talk about that in a moment. And he's also a student of history, of military history, of U.S. foreign policy history. And he has very close ties to Republican thinking on Capitol Hill. A little bit on Aaron's background. He's a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Previously, he was senior foreign policy advisor and legislative director to Senator Tom Cotton, who, as listeners to this podcast know, Tom Cotton has been on this podcast several times. Aaron also served on active duty as a U.S. Marine for 7 years, deploying to Afghanistan as an infantry officer. That was in the 2009-2010 period. Following his time in the operating forces, Aaron was assigned to the faculty of the U.S. Naval Academy, and he also has a very impressive academic background that predates his time in the military, including studying at Oxford University. He's also the host of a fantastic podcast called The School of War, which I highly recommend. If you're interested in military history, you will love this podcast. Aaron has a unique angle in terms of how he structures every one of these podcast episodes. You will learn a lot about different periods in military history. And in fact, we talk about his podcast in this conversation, and we also talk about the future of warfare, which has been the subject of a couple of his recent episodes. And before we move to the conversation with Aaron, a couple of housekeeping notes. First, as you've probably noticed, we have been dropping second episodes the last couple of weeks on Thursdays, and over the next couple of Thursdays, we will be hitting some interesting topics with interesting guests, including the implications of the Republican presidential debate, which takes place on Wednesday. And then we'll also be having a discussion about the Saudi-Israel normalization deal, which is picking up steam. I think it's moving along faster than people realize, even faster than the news accounts coming out of the UN General Assembly meeting in New York, in which Saudi and Israeli leaders were saying positive things publicly about its prospects. And one piece of this nuclear deal is the nuclear component, which is controversial and will be the subject of a lot of debate at some point, and we're going to unpack that and try to understand what that actually means for Saudi Arabia, for Israel, for the Middle East, and for the United States. So look out for those episodes. And finally, as you know from our previous couple of episodes, Saul Singer and I have our next book coming out in a few weeks, The Genius of Israel, The Surprising Resilience of a Divided Nation in a Turbulent World, very relevant to this moment in Israeli history and in Israel's future, and we will be having some conversations about it in the coming weeks. But in the meantime, please pre-order the book. Go to wherever you order your books. We care a lot about this book. If you care about Israel, I think you'll care about this book, and pre-orders are a big help to us. But now let's move on to the conversation with Aaron MacLean. And the question I really want to get to with Aaron, which is, what's with Republicans and Ukraine? This is Call Me Back. And I'm pleased to welcome to this podcast for the first time my longtime friend, Aaron MacLean from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, an alumnus of the office of U.S. Senator Tom Cotton, who's been a frequent guest on this podcast, and a Marine Corps veteran. Aaron, thanks for hopping on.
Dan, thanks so much for having me. I'm a longtime Call Me Back fan. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right. Well, we wind up for a variety of reasons speaking a lot throughout any given week. So it's good to those are offline conversations. So it's good to expose our listeners to one of those conversations as we flip this one online. And there's a lot I want to get into with you, and I want to start. We're going to talk about your origin story and the School of War podcast, which I'm a big fan of, and we're going to talk about your own experience in the military in a moment. But before we do, I want to start with this piece you co-authored with former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo about uh, the Russian war in Ukraine and why, as much as it may pain Republican members of Congress to do anything to help the Biden administration, this is a particular issue where, to quote Arthur Vandenberg, politics should stop at the water's edge, and we Republicans have a real stake in this. And I guess so. I want to start with your piece, but even before we start with your op-ed, where are we? So this episode is posting the week of September 26th. So the week of September 26th, where are we with regard to the debate over funding for the war in Ukraine?
Well, there's a short-term and a long-term answer to that. The short-term answer is, the White House has requested supplemental funds, 20-some billion dollars on top of the 100+ billion that we have already provided in support to the Ukrainian war effort. And it's a live issue. It's a live ball. So right now, it looks, your guess, Dan, as to the broader politics of this is as good as mine, but it looks as though the House is not going to voluntarily pass this. So the question is, will it come back to the House from the Senate in some form? Will we have a shutdown? Like, it's tied up in this broader network of questions about whether or not, the Congress can actually fund the government here in the weeks to come. And it is not a priority of House Republicans, it seems, to get it across the line, even though there are plenty of House Republican votes ultimately for aid for Ukraine, if you just made it a pure up or down question. So it'll probably get done is the short answer to the question, but the mechanism and timing of how it gets done in the weeks and months to come is a little unclear.
So just for our listeners, it appears that, as Aaron is saying, the funding will not pass as part of any kind of House package, continuing resolution, spending bill. The House will avoid it. The last time there was funding up in the House, only 70, I think something like 71 Republicans voted against funding. So the 221 Republicans, between the remaining Republicans and obviously the Democrats, there were enough votes to pass it. If you assume that all those 71 are guaranteed to vote vote against it this time, and that's probably a floor.
Yeah.
So there's going to be a lot more that join the no ranks. It starts to get a little dicey, which is why McCarthy, in order to cobble together the votes, really, really, really will have to depend on Democratic votes, which is why he's happy to let the Senate pass it. And McConnell and the Senate Republicans seem very strong on supporting the funding for Ukraine. So let the Senate Republicans pass it, and then it comes back to the House, and hopefully McCarthy can pass it that way. But I will tell you, I've been struck, Aaron. I spoke with a House Republican who's a leader, I won't mention his name, who's a leader on foreign policy, national security issues last week. And he's someone who's been rock solid on Ukraine, very supportive of the administration, of every funding request that's been made. And for the first time, he's saying, using language like blank check. I'm not gonna sign the blank check, and he'll probably still be for it in the end. But his language is getting tougher, and he's in a very, very red district, so he always worries about primary challenge from the right. And so you just start to see the pressure on these guys growing. And you and Secretary Pompeo make the point in your piece that the criticism from some on the hard right that are making, if you want to call it the hard right, I don't even know what to call it. So like the isolationist right, it's not necessarily like how we think traditionally of the right, but whatever you want to call that segment of the electorate in our party that's growing. Their argument is that Biden and the Biden administration has been doing too much. It's been too interventionist. It's been too muscular. And you guys, you and Pompeo in the first part of your op-ed lay out all how actually it's been the opposite.
Yeah.
If your frustration with Biden is that he's been too involved, it's actually been the exact opposite. We should be encouraging him to do more.
Yeah, no. So credit where it's due in terms of what Ukraine critics on the right are saying. There's a lot to be skeptical about and a lot to be critical of in the Biden administration's handling of the war. Though I, of course, agree exactly with what you just pointed out, that the right is coming at it from the wrong direction. Prior to Putin reinvading Ukraine in February of 2022, the Biden administration was engaged in a multi-stage process of appeasement, essentially, of Vladimir Putin, which is a time-honored Washington tradition, certainly a Democratic Party tradition stretching back, into the Obama administration, if you recall the reset button and all of that. I mean, we were just trying the same thing again, and this came up in issue after issue, whether it was the Nord Stream pipeline, whether it was arms control negotiations with the Russians, and then on Ukraine itself, excuse me, which, if you recall, in the actual lead up to the fight, the Biden administration was bending over backwards, essentially, to find some way to accommodate Putin rather than find ways in which to effectively deter him. And there was this, one moment kind of serves as an illustration of the spirit of the times when Biden, sort of musing to the press, comments that, look, if there is some sort of minor incursion, I'm paraphrasing here, but this is in fact the spirit of what he said, there's some sort of minor incursion of Russia into Ukraine, that's the kind of thing that we could deal with. And sort of language like that to someone like Putin communicates profound unseriousness. And he did not take the West seriously. He did not take Joe Biden seriously. Very dangerously, he did not take the Ukrainians seriously and the Ukrainian capacity for self-defense seriously either. And so he invaded. And so, look, I get it. I get why, I think if we can imagine an alternative universe where we have a Republican president who did things that we like on the deterrence front. And if the war started, handled the war in a way that gives us confidence and made public statements explaining his strategy or her strategy and sort of led the country, we probably wouldn't be in the situation we are in, bleeding Republican votes for support, or at least not as many Republican votes. So the Biden administration's handling of it is absolutely the kind of proximate cause of some of the trouble that we are in. And on some level, I'm sympathetic to it, even though, again, I think the actual analysis of the situation is that Biden has been too weak, not too strong. I fear, I should add, that's the proximate and superficial cause of our problems. I do worry that our problems are deeper than that. I worry that we have emerging problems about the Republican Party's commitment to the security of Europe and to internationalism more broadly that come from deeper places and from older places in the party.
And do you if we had a Republican president who were out there making the case for our involvement, or at least not our direct involvement, but our support of the Ukrainian war effort, do you think that would change it? In other words, during obviously the Bush years, you had a Republican president who was very committed to engagement in global affairs. During the Reagan and first Bush administration, meaning George H.W. Bush, you had Republican presidents who were willing to make the case publicly for engagement, and Republicans rallied. And do you think this is, if you had a Republican president, if you had a President Haley or DeSantis or Scott or, whomever out there making the case, that this is just like Republican voters are just responding to, they don't want to do anything to help Biden. They find the least inspiring political figure and leader they could possibly imagine. So there's nothing he could be for that we could be for, they would say.
Yeah, look, it would be a lot better that we would not be kind of getting to the crisis level of vote loss that we have at this point. But again, I do think there are deeper and more troublesome things going on here. And it is the case that when you go out, I'm sympathetic to these members. They go back to their districts, especially the red districts, right? And it is not a happy subject to discuss. Right. Support for Ukraine for all sorts of reasons. Look, I think for me, the thing that is hard to grapple with is I was born in 1981. Right. Mm-hmm. So,
Jesus.
Ronald Reagan.
Do you have to say
Party.
that? My God. You're literally, honestly, Aaron, I've never heard you say that. You are literally 10 years younger than
Well,
me.
I'm
My God.
curious. Let's see if our perspectives differ here, because I'm curious to know what difference those 10 years make. Because for me, um, my formative memories, political memories, are of Ronald Reagan, and then George H.W. Bush, the end of the Cold War, the Cold War that the Republican Party wins with its particular sort of mix of internationalist policies. And then we have the 90s, which we'll fast forward through quickly here in my account. And then you have 9/11, and you have George W. Bush and the War on Terror. And so all of which is to say that for me, the Republican Party is the party of American leadership abroad. It is, broadly speaking, and I realize these are all extremely crude generalizations, but it is the party that, generally speaking, is more comfortable with the use of military force. In my lived experience, it was the Democratic Party that was skeptical of the military, skeptical of military budgets, skeptical of what American hard power could achieve abroad. And so it is disorienting for me to have been born at the moment I was born, and to grow up through the world that I grew up through, to suddenly confront the fact that actually none of these things that I thought were just like woven into the structure of America's political universe, like this is just how it is, that actually that's not true. The longer tradition of the American right, I'm about to make a series of very pessimistic statements actually, is one in which actually skepticism of internationalism, even kinds of varieties of isolationism, is actually the dominant trend. And how can that be? Well, my theory is that
So that basically, you're basically arguing that these years that you and I like to say you and I came of age during, because it implies that I'm younger, at least in spirit, than I am in years. But the timeline you focused on is spot on. I mean, that is so just to insert here. So I was 10 years old. I'm amazed that at age 10 or 11 or 12 you were following the end of the Cold War, but I admire it. But I was 10 years older than you, but following it obviously very closely. And Reagan is who made me a Republican. I mean, that's how I became a conservative. And it was largely, by the way, on foreign policy issues. My the story of the Holocaust, the Shoah, is obviously a big foundational, sadly, tragically, story of our family history. And when I started to study the history and became more tuned into the history, I realized that the party or government or person responsible for the greatest number of atrocities in the 20th century was Adolf Hitler, second only to the communists. And the sense that Reagan and the Reagan administration, that was a big part of what infused the Reagan commitment to human rights and to the Cold War and to the Reagan doctrine. And that was partly how I became a conservative. But and it's Reagan and it's Thatcher, and obviously it's George H.W. Bush, which you and I probably would disagree with some of the things George H.W. Bush was for, but on balance was an extension of that tradition. And I think what you're saying is, on the one hand, that kind of that was a formative period for people like you and me on our thinking, but you're saying for the right it was actually an outlier.
Yeah, an aberration. That's my fear. And stepping back and looking at the long history of the right through the 20th century, I fear there's like plenty of evidence for it. It's very significant, by the way. You point out the connections between the period in which we grew up. I'm being very generous here. The period in which we grew up, and the World War II generation, who folks who had served as relatively young people in the Second World War were running the show when we were sort of first figuring things out for ourselves. I think that was very important. And I think the fact that the World War II generation has disappeared almost to a man at this point, we have the last few folks hanging around, is also part of our problem. But that's my point, that a series of exogenous shocks essentially has kept the American right largely internationalist through the middle and second half of the 20th century. I mean, going back to Pearl Harbor, which kills the original America First movement. Though if you look at the days immediately following Pearl Harbor, very interestingly and relevantly to our present day debates, there is a multi-day period where you have voices in the Republican Party arguing that, okay, obviously we need to fight Japan now, but we can keep out of Europe. We can still stay out of Europe. And it's Hitler's declaration of war on the United States a few days after Pearl Harbor that finally puts that to bed. But you have World War II.
Meaning, left to their own devices, the right, even after Pearl Harbor, were ready to still
Sure.
steer clear of Europe.
Some, yeah, for sure.
Wow.
Some, absolutely. And then, you have the Soviet Union come to the fore. You have the blockade of Berlin. You have the invasion of Korea. So again, you have a couple of shocks, helpfully with a left-wing bad guy, right, in the form of the Soviet Union, that makes the Republican Party stay responsible. But even then, in 1952, Robert Taft, the isolationist leader of the Republicans in the Senate, is almost the party's nominee. Dwight Eisenhower runs for the nomination to deny Taft the nomination. So even there's like an element of contingency. Eisenhower obviously becomes the president. We go through the Cold War. We enter the period that you and I were discussing. And then in the 90s, I mean, I can remember, and I was, to your point, yes, Dan, I was a bit of a nerd. And I grew up in the Washington area too. My parents were news junkies. And so, we watched the McLaughlin Group every weekend and stuff like that. This is a confessional.
My kids are suffering through Jets games. And you were watching, PBS political talk shows. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, this is becoming a confessional. But I can, I remember in the 90s, obviously you have Pat Buchanan. Like these elements of the right never die. They never actually go away, but they are very much the minority report on the right. But in the 90s, you have Republican opposition to intervention in the former Yugoslavia. I remember that well. I remember my father, who was of the World War II generation and a lifelong, well, at least in the part of his life that I came along, a Republican. And I remember him, making sort of semi-bitter comments along the lines of, Aaron, these people have been killing each other for thousands of years. We need to kind of stay out of this kind of thing. Like, so it's, in the 90s, you kind of saw a bit of a resurgence of it. And then you have 9/11, the last exogenous shock. And now in Ukraine, you have, a threat to American security that is, at a remove. You have to kind of explain the ways in which Putin's invasion of Ukraine is a threat to American security. Obviously, I believe that it is. And you have, you don't have the Soviet Union. You have if anything, I mean, it's a crude use of the spectrum, but you have a right-wing baddie in Vladimir Putin, not a left-wing baddie. And so, these forces that have been not dormant, but again, the minority report in the party, it's deep. It's all of which it's just deeper than discussed at Joe Biden. There's more going on.
Okay, so Aaron, I want to just pivoting off something you just said. I want to quote from your piece, the piece that you and Secretary Pompeo wrote. You say here, and we'll post this piece in the show notes. But you wrote here, a Russian victory would raise the chances of expanded war in Europe, with Putin contemplating the seizure of more lost elements of the Russian Empire, whether in whatever is left of Ukraine or beyond. It would be taken as proof by the Chinese communists eyeing Taiwan that America is unserious, making a war in the Pacific more likely. I really want to spell that out, because to me, this is the most catastrophic, jarring reality, which is that if Putin were able to steamroll into Ukraine, which thank God he's not been able to, that of course, if he were met with little resistance, he would keep going. And when I make that point, people sort of roll their eyes. Either they don't believe it or they don't seem to care. People on the right. So first of all, can you articulate why you feel certain or relatively certain that Putin wouldn't stop at Ukraine if he were able to just move quickly, expeditiously through Ukraine?
For Vladimir Putin, the collapse of the Soviet Union was the signal geopolitical catastrophe of his lifetime, of the 20th, or certainly the second half of the 20th century. And it is quite clear that he sees his project as, on some level, its reconstitution. Now, he knows that the most robust version of that is probably not possible, but he has also demonstrated through his actions going back to at least 2008 in Georgia that he intends to make progress towards that goal. And if he can split NATO in the process, all the better. So this is where you get into these interesting debates with these sort of international relations theorists, these quote unquote realists who want to blame the whole thing on NATO expansion, right? That it's the West's expansion east, essentially, that has provoked Vladimir Putin into this. And while it's certainly the case that Vladimir Putin does not look on a Western-oriented Ukraine favorably from a security standpoint, it is, again, it's sort of coming from a deeper place for him. He has a vision of Russian nationalism that is tied up with Russian imperialism. And with all these, I don't know how deep you want to get into this stuff, but with all these sort of intellectual currents swirling around Russia over the course of the last generation, writings of this guy, Alexander Dugin, this concept of Eurasianism, the way in which Russia will lead a Eurasian movement that stands against the West, both in literal political terms, right? There will be an imperial space that is non-Western, but also in terms of its moral values, will stand against the degrading progressivism that Europe and the United States have come to represent. Which, by the way, this starts to get us into problems, right, in our American political debate about these things, because the right looks at progressivism and doesn't really like what it sees, and it sees an international enemy of progressivism, and there are those in the right who think they're looking at a friend. But that's his vision. I think, look, I don't think it's that hard of a case to make, to go back again to start in 2008 and point out that the attitude here is expansionist. And this is hard for people to accept. It's hard for liberals to accept in particular, even though they seem to have finally come around. Because, I mean, to quote John Kerry, this is just not how we behave in the 21st century. Irredentist drives to reclaim, lost territory. Like that's 19th century behavior. That's literally what he said, yeah. Right? Well, John Kerry doesn't get to say what is 19th or 21st century. It turns out you can do it in the 21st century just fine, and Putin is doing it. And I absolutely think, and again, I think the burden of proof is on those who would argue the contrary, that were Putin to have succeeded in a swift victory in Ukraine, or were he somehow now to bring about some sort of pause in the fighting that was favorable to him. Let's say that somehow Kyiv fell, or there was some sort of unambiguous positive Russian outcome that then gave him a few years to reconstitute himself and his forces. Yes, he would keep going. He would possibly go into what's left of Ukraine if he felt that he wanted to try his luck. The Baltics are always there, the Baltic states. The reality is he's strengthened NATO, at least for now, right? Through all this. So he's dealt himself a series of blows. But to use an old saying, he's going to keep probing until he meets steel.
So, that argument about that NATO expansion, U.S. policy, this is like basically the John Mearsheimer argument. He gave this lecture at the University of Chicago before the most recent war, and he laid out this argument. I'm the number of people that have sent me the YouTube video of that speech is, and then I go look at the views on it, and it's like it's some crazy number. I mean, millions and millions, maybe even over 10 million views of this speech, and he lays it out. And if you don't know much, it's quite persuasive. And at some point, I thought about having like our friend Fred Kagan or someone just come on the podcast and literally just break down Mearsheimer's speech, because it is scary how resonant it is with so many people, not only in our party but just generally.
Yeah, and what Mearsheimer can't get, and he's just. By the way, I just read he has a brand new book out with this guy Sebastian Rosado, who's a student of his, called How States Think, and I have read it for my sins, and I'm actually I'm writing a review of it right now.
Excellent.
And he cannot wrap his mind around the fact that domestic politics matters, or he can wrap his mind around it. He simply rejects it. So everything we just discussed about Putin's worldview is to Mearsheimer completely irrelevant, because the domestic politics ideologies of states, ideologies of leaders are essentially meaningless when it comes to understanding state behavior. States simply are security-seeking entities. In Mearsheimer's variety of realism, they tend to seek power in order to preserve their security. The fact that Vladimir Putin is possessed of these crazy neo-imperial visions is neither here nor there. In Mearsheimer's view, a liberal democracy in Moscow would be behaving the same way. To me, that stretches credulity. I find that hard to accept. But Mearsheimer is just at the level of international relations. I can't take him that seriously. Unfortunately, I should add, he also he's been publishing these battlefield commentaries of what's going on in Ukraine. He had this long Substack essay a few weeks ago basically about how he's been right all along, and the Ukrainian counteroffensive has failed, and it was doomed to fail. I think that's actually the name of the piece. And when you get into Mearsheimer's battlefield analysis, and I'm going to say something that our friend Fred Kagan would probably, if he were here, slap me for saying, it's more defensible. Mearsheimer's very pessimistic view of the battlefield in Ukraine is more defensible, and I do think it's hard sitting here at the end of September to paint a picture of the Ukrainian counteroffensive's progress that is rosy. It has been slow going at best, and the Russian defensive complex has been proven to be quite effective. And Mearsheimer is taking great pleasure in that, which is exasperating. But he's not wrong. It's simply a fact. It's slow going.
So on your School of War podcast, your most recent episode was with Mick Ryan, who is an Australian military officer. Is that right?
That's right. Retired Australian general.
Okay. And he is, the topic of the episode, which is excellent, we'll post it in the show notes as well. Highly recommend it. It's called Russia, Ukraine, Taiwan, and Future of War. But you made a point early in the episode. Basically, so much of what we collectively, the West, are hoping for is some change in politics in Moscow, and we saw that this would obviously yield potentially enormous strategic benefit to us if things just got shaken up in the politics of Russia rather than on the battlefield, because obviously if there's a shakeup in the politics of Russia, then you could have a derivative of that, a shakeup on the battlefield, and so that's what we're hoping for. And obviously the Prigozhin mutiny that was ultimately suppressed, but at the peak of the mutiny, we thought, oh my gosh, this is the beginning of something. And so, and we were waiting to see how it would shake out. It seems to have been stabilized. But you also made the point that Putin and the Russian leadership are hoping for some political shakeup in Washington.
Right.
They're looking for the same strategic advantage, with the politics being turned upside down somehow, that would gain them some advantage on the battlefield, albeit indirectly. And coming back to the beginning of our conversation, do you think they're looking at this discussion we're having now and the debate we're having now, and they're following people like Mearsheimer and the following he has, and the debate over congressional funding, and the Russian Embassy Congressional Affairs Office is going back to Moscow and saying, the 71 House Republicans voted against funding last time. We think it's going to be, 111 this time, or, and they're analyzing all this, and they're as giddy and cautiously optimistic as we were at the peak of the Prigozhin mutiny, or like what we thought the implications of that would be. They're watching our politics play out right now over the funding debate, and they're just as giddy.
Yeah, absolutely. No question about it. I mean, giddy may slightly overstate it, but they see reasons to be optimistic. They see reasons to hope. I mean, you have a military stalemate. This is, again, where our friend Fred Kagan would probably slap me, but you have something like a stalemate on the battlefield. You have
Fred, if you're listening, it's Aaron.MacLean at no, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
You have a battlefield stalemate. And look, by the way, if you press these guys, Mick Ryan's a brilliant guy with an incredible record of service, and he's a sort of self-professed optimist on the Ukrainian cause. And I am a supporter of the Ukrainian cause, of course, but you press folks who are optimistic about their battlefield prospects, and the language starts to get, they start to talk about, there's a lot of domains of warfare. There's, of course, this ground campaign and the counteroffensive, but you have to keep in mind there's also the information campaign. There's this, there's that. And then, there's this question of like, could Russian politics ultimately implode? And to me, some of that does seem to sort of distract from the hard military realities that the Ukrainians are facing on the battlefield, where there's just not a ton of progress. But yeah, we, of course, we supporters of Ukraine would like to see, Vladimir Putin get it, essentially, which has risks of its own, of course, because there's no guarantee, by the way, that what comes out of any kind of unstable moment in Russia like that is better for the West or better for Ukraine. It could possibly be worse. Nevertheless, like when you're stuck in a stalemate like that, you're looking for something to alter the fundamental calculus on either side. They're looking for the same thing to happen on our side, for a new American administration that is perhaps a cold to the Ukrainian cause, for a split in NATO, right? You have Hungary already skeptical of the Ukrainian cause. You have forces in Polish politics. You have forces in Slovakian politics.
But have you been surprised about Poland? I mean, despite the political winds, the way they were blowing in Polish politics, I get that this, for Poland more than most countries, Russian advances into Ukraine could pose an existential threat. I get that. It goes without saying. That said, I'm still surprised by how quickly the winds shifted politically in Poland as it related to Russia.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's obviously like positive, and I don't know if I was surprised by it exactly. I mean, the Poles, have a long tradition of being threatened by a Russian empire, and anything that suggests that a Russian empire is resurgent, it behooves them to take it seriously, and they are obviously taking it seriously. Of course, they have a long history of being crushed by the German Empire as well. It's the German, the German odyssey on all this has been the most fascinating to me. And it's sort of unsurprising to see that, in the first few months after the invasion in 22, they seemed to get very serious, and seemed to commit to higher targets for defense spending and so forth. I almost wrote, I didn't in the end. I blinked and had a moment of moral cowardice. But when there was this discussion of increased German defense spending, I did want to send in an op-ed somewhere like the Journal and say, guys, are we sure? Are we sure that we really want increased German defense spending? The contributions of a unified Germany to international security over the course of the last 150 years or so have been, decidedly mixed.
Right.
And are we all sure that's
negative.
what we want? Maggie
Right.
Thatcher, who both you and I admire, was opposed
Yeah.
to German reunification. There's something to be. Full disclosure, my dad was a World War II veteran. And the only acceptable, indeed insisted upon form of racism in the MacLean household when I was growing up was anti-German sentiment.
Right.
So it comes from a deep place for me, and I realize this is all a bit superficial and unfair. Nevertheless. But yeah, no. So obviously, just as we are sitting here sort of thinking about, gosh, wouldn't it be great if things fell apart in Moscow, and it changed the calculus in some way. And by the way, it's happened before in Russian history. You get people like, Mearsheimer and others saying, the Russians always win these long attritional fights. They get their act together and they grind it out. And obviously there's a record to support that. Well, in 1917, it didn't quite break that way. There was a long attritional fight and then the Russian state collapsed. But they're sitting, to your point, they're sitting there and hoping that something similar happens in the structures of NATO or the United States. If not a collapse of those structures, then a reorientation of them such that the Ukrainian interest is harmed.
I want to talk about your podcast a little more because there's another question that came up in one of your other episodes that I've been meaning to ask you about. But before we do that, can you just walk through a little bit about your history? I did some of this in the introduction, but how you wound up in the Marines, and then how your career went in the direction that it did after you left the Marine Corps.
Yeah, sure. So, like I said, I grew up in the DC area as a nerd, with parents who were news junkies and very engaged in politics. And I was in college on 9/11, and I, like a lot of folks, considered joining the military right away. As it happened, we invaded Iraq in March of my senior year of college, and in April we won. We won the war. The statue of Saddam came down, and I'd grown up with a Army veteran, career Army officer dad. And if you'd asked me as a kid, what's the one thing you're never going to do when you grow up, I would have said as a teenager, I'm never going to join the military. Never. Get up early in the morning, get yelled at, get short haircuts. None of this appeals to me. And so once it seemed like Iraq had been resolved and I was about to graduate college,
So this is April, the statue comes down April 9th, 2003. And I remember I was in Qasr that day, actually, the day I'd come from Kuwait, and then we went back to Kuwait that night. And then the civilian team in Iraq, or what became the civilian team in Iraq, made our move on April 15th. So this is, but just to timestamp it, so it's mid-April 2003. You're about to finish college, and you're watching all this, thinking, there we go again. The American military, does the right thing, performs brilliantly, and it's over.
Yeah, it was like the Gulf War Part 2.
Yeah, right.
And so I moved on. I already had arrangements to go to graduate school, so I went to graduate school, and but then obviously as the years went on, it became apparent that I had.
And you went and you studied what in graduate school?
Medieval Arabic thought, of all the hands-on
And
practical
where is
stuff
this? Where are you in graduate
at
school?
Oxford.
At Oxford.
And
Okay.
I'd done kind of great books in philosophy as an undergrad, and had pitched the folks who funded this course of study on, well, look, I've done the great books of the West, so I'll just kind of move east and keep going. And it was, immediately post 9/11, so they found that to be an attractive prospect, and it was interesting, and I learned plenty, but I also, it became apparent to me that in fact I had missed nothing. That there was a lot of fighting, in particular at this point, sort of 2004, 5, 6 in Iraq. And you were in Iraq in 3 and 4, is that right?
Yeah, I was there. I went to I went into Iraq full time, so to speak. I was in and out before April 15th, but I went in full time April 15th. Or before that, I was in Kuwait, and before that, I was in Doha at Camp Asaliya for a couple months. But during the major combat operations, but from April 15th, 03 till the end of June, 04.
Right.
So when we quote unquote handed over sovereignty at the end of June of 2004 is when I left, and that's when the kind of the Brimmer team left. So I was gone by summer of 04.
So I stayed in graduate school. I worked for a while as a freelancer in the Middle East. I was living in Cairo in 2006, and I finally just said to myself, this is if I feel like I have some sort of obligation to serve, both as an act of patriotism, but also just sort of because of what my family does. There's really no excuse. Like I'm missing something that there's no excuse to miss now. So I mean, I essentially flew back to the United States and joined the Marines. I mean, there's more to it, but that was basically what happened. And so I went through OCS. I became an infantry officer, and I ended up. I mean, I had decent Arabic at this point in my life, having lived in the region and studied Arabic for years. Never once set foot in an Arabic-speaking country. Not a layover in an airport. I think we flew over the Gulf on my way back from Afghanistan, so that was as close as I came. But I went to Afghanistan as a young infantry officer. I was platoon commander, acting company executive officer for a period, and it was a wild deployment on a human level, at a professional level. The Marine Brigade I was a part of when I first got there conducted the largest heliborne assault since Vietnam to seize this district called Marja. And Dan, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie A Bridge Too Far, great World War II movie.
No.
Okay. Well, first of all, I highly recommend it.
We're going to add it to our list.
It's wonderful, wonderful World War II movie starring everyone. I mean, everyone's. It's one of those movies. Michael Caine, Sean Connery, everyone's in this movie. But it's based on Operation Market Garden, where these airborne divisions were dropped on these different bridges, and then the plucky armored column led by Michael Caine has to drive through and connect them all. So I was in the equivalent of the Michael Caine organization, sort of driving through the minefields to get to these Marine heliborne assault companies that had gone into this Taliban stronghold. Unlike the movie and unlike Market Garden, we did in fact get to the Sean Connery organization. We made it to the end of the line, and then held on to this place. And there was pretty intense combat on the front end, and then it transitioned to classic small wars, counterinsurgency stuff, where this was really my real political education happened in these months, because I became, the de facto mayor of, a chunk of the southern part of Marja. And I had gone as a, card-carrying believer in, democracy promotion, the freedom agenda. I really thought that we were going to remove the Taliban boot from the neck of the oppressed Afghan farmer, who would then rise up and seek all the things that man naturally wants. You want to vote, you want, access to markets, et cetera, et cetera. And I quickly became more of what I'll describe as a small R realist. That this was just not how life in Helmand province went. That things were much more motivated by base considerations like greed and fear. And I had the most guns and money of any political player in my little part of town, and so everyone kind of had to, at the very least, pay attention to what we were doing. And I learned a lot, and learned some lessons in a very difficult manner. But it was that was sort of the most important part of my Marine experience. I ended up staying in for 7 years because I had the chance to go teach at the Naval Academy for the last 3 years I was in, because otherwise I would have gotten out right at the end of that time in Afghanistan. So then came to DC and have been doing a variety of odd jobs since. And you made reference to my service with Senator Cotton. I spent 2 years as his legislative director and foreign policy advisor. A crazy couple of years too, 2019 and 2020.
Right, and you were very. I remember when Cotton came out early, raising questions about the origin of COVID, and he was like one of the first, at least, public figures to policymaker types to author, if you will, the lab leak theory. And you were working for him
I
at the time,
was.
right?
I was. And I have to say, Senator Cotton was basically first out of the gate in terms of not just the lab leak dimension, which was an important dimension, which I believe he has been completely vindicated, but COVID more broadly. And credit where it's due. You know, as a former staffer, there's this tendency to want to sort of wink, note that like
Right.
the role the staff played or the role that you played. This was 100% Senator Cotton, Tom Cotton personally, who I can remember essentially walked into the office one day at the beginning of January 2020. And
Beginning of January
yes,
2020.
beginning of January.
Wow.
And we were, he obviously serves on the Intelligence Committee and
Yeah.
has access to information that I don't or didn't at the time and don't now. And nevertheless, there were open sources of information at the time. And there's this amazing newsletter, John Ellis News Items, which
I know well.
I'm an addict at this point in my life.
Yeah.
So John Ellis had a piece, aggregated a piece the last week of December 2019 about a mysterious flu-like illness that was...
Wait. So Ellis had a piece in his... By the way, this is John Ellis's piece. It's a Substack. It's, as Aaron said, it's called News Items. I highly recommend subscribing to it. It's the origin story of that is pretty amazing. So hold on. Let's just... So his piece is when? It's late 2019?
I believe it's the last week of December 2019. He's, in that list of stuff, he's got like one of the items is there's a mysterious flu-like illness in Wuhan. And Senator Cotton saw that and essentially instructed us, his team.
But were we at this point dialed into coming pandemic or no?
We being the United States and the United States government?
Yeah.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas? Yes.
Okay, so he sees that item.
Yes. And
I've never heard this part of the story. We've had Cotton on to talk about his work on the lab leak theory. I've never heard this. So this is like story behind the story.
Totally.
So he sees this little item. He comes into the office and says,
"Pay attention. Watch this. I want regular updates. This, essentially this could be a big deal." And we did, and that's sort of the first into the second week of January. And by the third week of January, where there is some international attention starting to focus on all this, and this is right around when the Chinese closed down travel out of Wuhan. But by the third week of January, he is basically the entire policy team for Senator Cotton, which for U.S. Senator is about 15 people, is at this point essentially monitoring this issue full time, providing him with regular updates. And he is beginning. The first big fight was actually not over the lab, but was over travel. And he begins to personally lobby President Trump, Vice President Pence, and we, on his behalf and at his instruction, began to lobby sort of all of our various contacts and counterpoints all across the government and, encourage other senators and their staffs to do the same, to shut down travel with China. That was the first sort of big evolution in all of this. And I don't think it's not an overstatement to say that if not for Senator Cotton, that question would not have been called as early as it was, which I actually do think bought us some time. The fact that we did at the end of January shut down travel bought us some time. I can also remember, by the way, sitting there in my office literally looking at the Google Maps of Wuhan with, there was that small CDC facility right near the wet market. And then there's the Wuhan Institute, which is not that far away across town, and looking at it with other members of the team and with Senator Cotton thinking, that all does look kind of close to one another.
Yeah.
Do we really think it came from a bat in the wet market?
So I will tell you, there's only one. This is an amazing. That is an incredible story. There's only one other political figure that I know who was as early on COVID as Tom Cotton, and that is Benjamin Netanyahu. And this is not a blanket defense of Benjamin Netanyahu, but it is we this is in this book I've talked about on this podcast the last few episodes. Saul Singer and I have a book coming out in November, which is a follow up to Startup Nation, and we have a chapter in the book on Israel dealing with COVID and its vaccination campaign. The chapter is called Vaccination Nation, on how Israel was very early not only on COVID but early on its vaccination campaign. But Ron Dermer tells us this story, who was at the time ambassador to the U.S. Netanyahu's ambassador to the U.S. and he's in some meeting with Netanyahu, and it's like late December, early January, and Netanyahu says things are about to really get shaken up in the U.S. And Dermer's like, what, you think Sanders is on the move? You think that he was thinking about the New Hampshire
Yeah.
primary, and he was like, Sanders, is gaining steam against Biden, and he's going to win New Hampshire, and and Dermer was totally focused on the Democratic primaries, and Netanyahu's like, all of that doesn't matter. He's like, watch this. It was a
Yeah.
version of what you're saying. He didn't have the John Ellis news item, and God knows what source of intelligence he had, but he was like, this there's something happening
Yeah. Yeah.
here with this virus that ultimately, and it's going to shake everything up in the
And
U.S.
I can remember Senator Cotton going on TV. I think it was, if not the third, at the latest, the fourth week of January. And this is the middle of the impeachment trial. Remember, this is Trump's first impeachment. Going on TV about impeachment and being asked questions about impeachment and essentially responding. I just think in a few months, and certainly in a few years, like none of us are going to remember this trial. I think that it's this flu-like illness in Wuhan that actually is going to be what characterizes the history of this period. And he has this talent. I watched him do it a few times when I was there, to take these prescient positions early, often positions that are outrageous to the left. The lab leak dimension of all of this was certainly outrageous to the left. Though, if I may, I should remind listeners that at the end of January 2020, the idea of shutting off travel with China was quote unquote xenophobic. And quote unquote racist, both terms that were hurled at Senator Cotton. To take the pandemic seriously in any way, or the fact that there would be a pandemic, was something that the left met with absolute hostility. But certainly the lab leak thing specifically, they did, and he was called any number of names. And again, I think it's just been totally vindicated. He has a trick where he does that.
Yeah, well, he did this also with Iran early on, with when I think he was in the House, maybe on the letter he wrote to Khamenei.
Yeah.
Basically, don't. Yeah,
brand new senator, I think. Brand new senator, and yeah, and then
or maybe it was maybe he's a freshman. Yeah,
and then the New York Times piece, which I was also there for, the op-ed in December of 2020, which was basically, long story short, like, let's use the National Guard. Let's use the National Guard. There is a tradition and a legal structure in America for restoring public order. He cited a poll in that piece that showed that such a position was popular, that a majority of Americans supported it. But obviously, the world, lit on fire in response to this op-ed. Certainly, the New York Times did, even though it was a reasonable policy proposal. And I think, again, in the long run, he was vindicated on that. It's a magic trick he does.
Okay, I want to before we wrap, I want to ask you about another one of your episodes on the podcast, on your podcast, which was about revolution in military affairs. It was with Andrew Krepanevich, who worked for years at the Office of Net Assessment in the Pentagon, which is sort of like an in-house think tank, if you will, in the Pentagon that works is at the works at the direction of the Secretary of Defense, and he's had a whole range of interesting positions. But one of the topics you two talk about is the changing character of warfare, and how and whatever form of warfare we are engaged in and we're learning a lot from doesn't necessarily serve us that well in the next phase of warfare we have to be involved in. And you and Andrew talk about your experience in Afghanistan, and the amount of time you spent, or the stories you were telling earlier in this conversation, side of the road, trying to figure out how to protect your fellow Marines from roadside IEDs, and just sort of the real kind of, in that case, counterinsurgency warfare, or the kind of counter trench warfare we're seeing in the Russia-Ukraine war now, and how all of these forms of war we're seeing, and those two are very different, will likely be dramatically different from what we will see potentially in a China-Taiwan confrontation. That the pace is moving so fast, both in technology and battlefield strategy of the war leaders, or the leaders leading countries that are engaged in war, that we spend all this time in Iraq and Afghanistan, a couple of decades, fighting one way, and we learned a lot. And in a sense, maybe irrelevant is too strong a word and obsolete is too strong a word, but it will matter so little to how we have to relative to how we'll have to engage with China and Taiwan.
Yeah, I mean, just to sum it up, the Afghanistan Iraq piece on this, I used an F-18 once. Called in an F-18 once, probably multiple times actually, to kill a Taliban IED emplacer with the gun, with the gun on, to do a gun run with an F-18. So this is a multi
So you call in F-18 to take out some dude at the side of
some
the
dude
road
with a shovel and a homemade bomb, right? So that's American power.
who's trying to just blow up some vehicle,
Yeah.
military vehicle.
He's trying to kill Marines. He's trying to kill Marines,
Right.
and we, smoke them if you got them. You have F-18s in a pattern, and that's what we're using F-18s for in 2010. Now, what's happening in Ukraine is a better guide, I think, as we try to visualize what could happen in the Pacific, but it's still not. It still doesn't get us there for a variety of reasons. The most important of which is, the United States and Russia are not at war in Ukraine. So you don't actually have a conflict between two major powers. I mean, Russia obviously is weaker than China, but nevertheless, you don't have a confrontation between two nuclear powers with well-funded, top-of-the-line militaries, which there are a lot of scenarios in the Western Pacific where that's what you could get, where you could get a direct clash between the United States and China, something that has not occurred since the early 1950s. I know you had Mike Gallagher on the show a few weeks ago to talk about
your co-instructor.
That's right. Talk about the Korean War.
Co-instructor.
That was the last time the United States and China fought each other. It was a different United States, but it was a very different China. The Chinese we talked about the Gulf War a little while ago. The Chinese, along with the rest of the world, paid very close attention to the Gulf War because the Gulf War signaled something about the progress of American arms that was unmistakable, that we had achieved. To Krepanevich's point, there had been a revolution in military affairs, of which the Gulf War was an illustrating kind of exclamation point, where we were able, through our combination of sensors and increased surveillance capability, to find and then strike with precision targets at a rate and in a cycle that was at that point, unseen in human history. And the amount of munitions you needed to destroy a target between, even Vietnam and the Gulf War, but certainly the Second World War and the Gulf War, had reduced by orders of magnitude. And to do this, you have to have a lot of money and you have to have a lot of technology. But the United States had taken the advances in information technology, space, right, the GPS system and so forth, and found ways to use these technologies for a war that made us circa 1991 to, utterly dominant. And so the Chinese military has spent a generation planning how to deal with the United States' abilities to win a war like the Gulf War, where we build up this expeditionary force, we establish this space where our sensors and strike capabilities can work, and then we essentially own the battlefield. And they have basically, the easiest way to understand what they've done is they've done the same thing with the sensor strike complex in reverse, right? They have got these capabilities for themselves. So we are now in what Krepanevich would call a mature revolution. That is to say, a revolution where both sides have achieved similar capabilities. So they have a sensor strike complex. We have a sensor strike complex. Theirs is much closer to their country. We have to still forward deploy if we're going to do anything within the first island chain or in Taiwan, which is obviously a big advantage to them. And their operating concept is to create this anti-access area denial space where if we go inside of it, we try to come to the rescue of Taiwan, we get killed. Now, so that's kind of where we've been. That's where we've been / where we are. But your question is, what does the future look like? Those are the to use the Rumsfeldism, those are the sort of the known unknowns, is like thinking through how that's going to work if there's actually a direct clash. But there's so many other elements to warfare now that actually have never really been employed at scale, certainly obviously not in a clash of major powers. You have these new domains of war like cyber. You have these new technologies like AI and the kind of autonomous systems that they can that technology can drive. You have just areas of warfare where there has not been warfare in the past, like space, right? You have these creepy new technologies like DNA targeting, biological weapons, right? Which is a thing, by the way, in case folks have not been tracking that. How does all of this look? Like, what does it look like? And by the way, there's still nukes. Like, you still have 2 nuclear armed powers.
Oh,
By
yeah.
the way,
Oh, by the way.
and the Chinese
Yeah.
are doing their best, by the way, to expand their arsenal. So, Walter Mead has a great series of pieces over at Tablet, actually on American Domestic Politics, which he sort of opened with the discussion of how we're kind of in this moment of a singularity, where the pace of technological change is so fast that it's hard for any of us sitting here to just picture what the world's going to look like in 10 or 20 years. It's like we can't see through the singularity. We can't see through the black hole. And my broadest point is, I mean, the same thing is happening in warfare, and the existence of the nuclear weapons and the deterrent power that they have, provided in terms of heading off a major power clash since 1945. Has contributed to this, because it has obviously in good ways kept major powers from clashing. So you don't see these technologies at work. I fear, my deepest fear is we're in a situation a little bit like Athens and Sparta before the launch of the Peloponnesian War, where Thucydides famously has this comment that the war is so savage and so dramatic because these two civilizations are at their peaks. They're at the peak of their power, their wealth, their adoption of different technologies, and then they put them to essentially mutual destruction. The pace of technological change affects warfare too, and it is really, really difficult to think about what the generation to come looks like. And I have kids, so it worries me, and it should worry us all. And not to end this philosophical discourse with a shameless plug, but like this is the project we're engaged in at School of War. Like, this is what I try to use the podcast for, is to pick apart different little pieces of this.
So before you go, I know we've gone way longer than I said, but it's a fascinating conversation. Two things. So what is the focus of the School of War? I mean, I talked about it a little bit in the introduction, but what are you trying to do with it? Because it's one of those novel concepts for a podcast I've seen out there.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's been a lot of fun. It's gotten, frankly, more attention than I had anticipated it would. It started out as a borderline self-indulgent project where I would invite people who had recently written something interesting about military history or strategy or even diplomatic history sometimes to come on the show and talk about their work. And the broader project is that the study of military history specifically, but also strategy and diplomatic history as well, is in a perilous state in the American Academy. I mean, we've done a lot of speculating this episode, so we could speculate as to why, possibly as a consequence of Vietnam and the American left's sort of hostility to the military, the notion that you would simply, as a serious scholar, say, study what happened in World War II. Why did this or that campaign in North Africa go well or poorly as the work of an academic? I mean, is basically unheard of in the American Academy today. It exists. There are points of light out there, but it is not a robust community. Strangely enough, it's a little bit healthier in the UK. I've discovered there are per capita, there is more high quality scholarship coming out of the UK on these subjects. So part of it was,
which is interesting because the UK defense establishment seems to be in such a state of kind of perilous, disrepair, lack of attention, lack of resource allocation.
Yeah. I think that's obviously correct, but for some reason, the British Academy seems less diseased than ours. So the idea was, war is a terrible thing, but ignorance of war is dangerous, because all of us as citizens, right, are going to be affected by a war, by a great power clash. We vote, and then some of us work in Washington on policy and political questions, and so ought to know more of this than we do. And so at the most basic level, that's the project of the podcast, is to try to teach lessons about war. And we talk to former general. We had H.R. McMaster on the show. We have scholars on the show. We have historians, and we go back and forth. I have an episode coming out on Spartan grand strategy this week. So it's we go back to ancient days and right up to the present. And I have a very simple method of choosing episodes, which is, if it's an interesting person with something interesting to say, broadly speaking, on these subjects, they come on the show and we talk just like this.
It's great. I highly recommend it. It's School of War. We'll post it in the show notes. There are more topics I wanted to talk to you about, but we're going to have you come back on because, his head will grow. But I didn't expect us to get so diverted with like an 8-minute, geek out on Tom Cotton. But such is life. But it was actually quite illuminating, the entire discussion. So I appreciate you taking the time. And look forward to having you back. I mean, you're not at Gallagher level yet. He's on path to his fifth episode, but you're getting started. So there's you have a future.
I am genuinely honored. This has been a blast. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks, Aaron. That's our show for today. To keep up with Aaron MacLean, you can find him on the website formerly known as Twitter. You can search for @Aaron, AARONB, his middle initial, MacLean, MacLean. And of course, you can find his work at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, also on the website formerly known as Twitter. You can find him at @FDD. Call Me Back is produced by Lon Benatar. Until next time, I'm your host, Dan Senor.